So we're going to talk about building a positive incident culture. This is a really important topic to me for obvious reasons, not just because of the startup that I run, but just because of the cultural impacts that I've seen at other FANG type companies over my career, and the power of having sort of a widespread culture within your organization that recognizes incidents and best practices, that doesn't just live within small teams. So we're going to talk a lot about how you can propagate this type of a culture out across the company today, not just about how you can go and build like a 3 or 4 person team that does responses. This is, I think, a much broader topic that hopefully you can take back and apply really directly into your organizations. I think we already did my intro, so I'm not going to go too much deeper on me. This is me, CEO, co-founder of this company, previously Facebook, previously a startup before that had us lead eventually to going into Facebook. But let's start talking about incidents a little bit. Everyone hates incidents. It's it's sort of the universal truth of incidents inside of companies. They're generally looked at as incredibly negative, horrific events that enforce a set of processes that no one really wants to be part of. Like that's how most companies kind of respond to incidents. And when we talk about and think about incidents, we tend to kind of use this secondary definition, right? A violent event, right? A fracas, an assault. I think we think about incidents generally within companies, within teams, within our personal lives, very much as like, these are the assaulting moments. I don't know if any of you who live in cities have the app called Citizen, which distributes like incidents as they happen inside of your town. And they're always, someone's being mugged, cars running into another car, these horrific events. But when we start to talk about incident culture and the value of that throughout companies, you actually kind of want to just focus on this first item, which is incidents really at their core is they're just a thing that happens inside of your company, and they're not an unusual thing to happen, and they're not necessarily bad. Incidents can spread a pretty wide range within your organization. Maybe you practice today Sev 1, Sev 2, Sev 3. You can actually practice way back all the way to like Sev 5 or informational. And when we start to think about why incident as a culture, not just incidents as like a small team practice, is interesting, it's because of the understanding and acceptance within your company that these things are probably happening more often than you even realize. And are not necessarily all horrific moments that require, finger pointing and unpleasant process. So we're going to talk a lot about that. The reason that it's worth talking about incidents this way, in sort of this more broad sense, as opposed to sort of the individual catastrophic moment sense, is because we want to back up a little bit and think about why we care about incidents at all inside of companies. And it's really because we want to focus not just on that recovery of the incident, of the horrible thing happening, but we really want to focus on long-term resilience within the organization and resilience within a company, right? The ability to survive for long periods of time, stronger for the scars that have happened to you, is really based on those cultural changes. I think long-term, more so than they are necessarily just based on an individual recovery for an individual event. So when I usually lead into this, we like to talk a lot about who's good at it, who are we modeling after when we think about these cultural changes. I usually think about the FANGs. These folks started doing this stuff a little bit earlier than most people: Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google. These days, you've also got a series of other unicorns that are kind of catching up here in sort of the Stripe space. I'd actually point to Fastly as being pretty good at this. Cloudflare is fantastic. These are organizations that have really adopted a lot of the modern practices that changed pretty interestingly in ways I'll talk about in this presentation over the last 5 or 10 years from what they were before that. But if you actually go back one more level, which is usually worth doing when you're trying to figure out where practices actually come from, Facebook, Apple, they didn't invent any of this stuff, right? Most of this stuff comes from the airline industry. Most of this stuff comes from industries where you can intentionally put forth long-term resiliency efforts over decades, because your outcome, right, is fewer loss of life, is more people surviving in travel. And so airlines really are the crucible of where a lot of this came from. And we'll talk a lot about kind of the sourcing of the tenets that I'm going to dive into here over the next few slides as coming from the airline industry. And we'll also talk a little bit about how the airline industry has changed the way that they approach this problem, even in the last couple of decades. Despite the fact that most of their work started around like the 1950s, 1940s, post-World War II, is where most sort of human factors sort of changes began kind of propagating into what we now call modern incident management. So I like to lead with the important stuff. These are the things that you can do inside of your company very aggressively, like out of the gate, that will make you have a more positive incident culture throughout. We're going to dive into each of these. So making incident response company-wide practice, practicing blame-free post-mortem culture, providing a well-defined process for declaring, I'm sorry, I hate reading slides. I'm just going to read this one, I promise. Well-declared process for responding to and learning from incidents, and embracing continuous process improvement through learning. These are really like the core bullet points. If you drop off the call right now, you don't like my voice, you don't want to hear any more of this, screenshot this slide. This is the stuff that you can do. It's all really pretty straightforward to do, but doing these things throughout the organization are really what will help you have that stronger culture and gather better resiliency. And so I'm going to spend most of this talk talking about the depth of what you can specifically do to implement each of these in a reasonable way. And we're going to pause twice throughout this. So after the first two, to go ahead and break out into breakouts and talk a little bit more specifically about incidents that have happened in your organizations. And then at the end, to dig a little bit more deeper into what you can do around embracing that continuous learning side of things. So let's start with incident response as a company-wide practice. Why? Why don't we just do this inside of SRE teams? Why don't we just have blameless culture be something that a small response team can have that they go and deploy out? Well, we can point back here to the airline industry for where we're looking for resilience and a change that actually happened in the 90s. So if you look at the long-term history of incident response practices that came out of the airline industry, most of them had to do with the next topic, with blamelessness, with how do we go and stop pointing fingers at individual people, and how do we start implementing strong systemic process around recovering from problems in ways where we learn from them. And by the 90s, the airline industry had gotten really good at this. We'd gotten to the point where their process was really solid, but what they realized was planes were still crashing because the process wasn't being implemented often enough. And so there was this realization that what had to happen was an overall increase in incidents. And what I really mean by incidents, I mean incident reporting, right? What you actually need is once you have a process in place of any sort that's successful, you have to implement it as aggressively as possible across the organization. And so around 94, 95, airline industries in America implemented this across the board. In terms of incentivizing incident reporting, encouraging more folks up and down the line, from pilots all the way down to maintenance personnel, to file these incidents. And the result has been the safest period of flight in the history of mankind over the last 20 years. In America, it's in the billions of passengers carried on commercial airlines without a single fatality. It's amazing. And so this is sort of the first big point we tend to push out, when I'm talking to customers when it comes to Kintaba, but also when I'm talking about the difference between a company, like a Facebook and a Google and sort of, your average maybe mid-market organization, is this implementation of the concepts that we're about to follow throughout the organization. So really more incidents, that's what you're chasing, and you're getting more incidents by spreading this approach that we're going to talk about. Space industry is the other really good reference for this, NASA. So NASA needs incidents so badly. They need more people practicing incident management so badly. They actually grab it from other places in the industry. They'll go find accidents and outages and catastrophes in other organizations, and they'll write their own postmortems inside of the organizations internally that they think might be affected. This is sort of like the coolest thing to me when it comes to like driving this point home in terms of like how many people are practicing incident management. Well, if your organization isn't big enough, you have to even get people outside of your company to be practicing it and pull those things inwards. So that's kind of my base concept here of like, why would you look at this from a company culture standpoint, not just an individual team standpoint? Obviously, the piece of culture that you really want to start pushing out, the core piece of culture here, once you're kind of going to push it out to your entire organization, becomes this concept of your blameless postmortem culture. And this isn't necessarily something that's only scoped down to the postmortem. We call it postmortem culture because that's where it grew from, but it's really this overarching concept of blamelessness. This is our natural thing to do as humans, right? Like, this is what we do. We blame other people, and we consistently do it even after accepting theoretically the idea that we shouldn't. If you look at some of the most recent, even airline industry situations, the Boeing 737 MAX is a great example. The first couple of public reports that came out on those accidents were actually very blameful reports, right? They were pilot error reports, right? We were saying this is the pilot's fault. That was a poorly trained pilot. That pilot didn't know what he was doing. That's why that plane crashed. Even though long-term we realized that wasn't what was going on. This is the hardest human tendency to overcome within any organization. And it's the practice that when you start to implement as a cultural change, you will have to continually reinforce from the top down daily within the organization, to the point where, at an organization like Facebook, we would have Mark coming into conversations happening on the internal forums, to correct blameful culture in places where even the folks who ought to have been championing it at the sort of lieutenant and executive level were acting in the wrong way. So this is sort of our biggest point that we want to go push from a cultural standpoint when we think of blameless culture. And there are entire books on this stuff. You can go read. Sidney Dekker has a fantastic book about human factors. Google has an SRE book with a lot of this stuff written down. I kind of like to boil these things down to just a couple of major points when we're thinking about blameless culture. And you can kind of break them into cultural things that you need to just accept as an organization and consistently push, and then like actual practice efforts when you're working on things like your postmortems. And the cultural side is really these 2 points, right? So accepting that failure is unavoidable. You are not going to be able to avoid failure. It's the primary worst sign you can get, right, as an engineer joining a team, is working on a team where the manager tells you, we don't have failure here, we don't have incidents here, right? It's an impossible situation. Culturally, as an organization, it's better to embrace the idea that you're going to have them and actually eagerly anticipate these incidents. And when they come, expect them as opportunities to learn. And then secondly, assuming good intent. This is something that as an executive, as a CTO, you can really push daily inside of the organization, right? No one's coming to work to do a bad job. And if they are coming to work to do a bad job, that's actually an HR problem. That's not an incident response problem and management problem. And you want to separate these two things. If your hiring bar isn't broken, which hopefully it's not, you're all working at mature, good organizations that have well-established hiring bars, I would imagine, then you can come out of the gate in every conversation, in every incident, in every situation with an idea that people are coming to work each day to do a good job, and that your job as an executive is not to blame them for things that have happened to them. Moving forward into practice, this is where we kind of come into now, how do you enable those folks, right? So number one is understanding the context. And this isn't just about you understanding the context. This is about allowing the people who are closest or involved in the incidents to actually tell their story and own that reflection process. Postmortem should always be started by the people who are at the center of the fire, because from the outside, we're always going to have incorrect 2020 vision into hindsight of what we think you should have known at the time. But only the person there has that context of what systemically happened to them. This all originated back in like the 30s or 40s, actually, in like factory floors, where foremen would start to have folks who had made mistakes actually send memos out to the entire organization about what they did wrong, what went wrong. And I think it was actually probably originally meant as a punishment, right? It was like, let's shame these folks. But the outcome of it was very positive. The outcome was you got a lot more insight into what really caused the problem. I was too busy with this thing during shift change. Joe came over and he was getting his coffee, and we always put our coffees down on this table, and the leg's been bad on that table forever, and it finally fell over. There's all of this context they have. And practicing that understanding of the context, where that's your primary goal within an organization when you're dealing with an incident, is the way you can really start to expose that stuff. And that permits the second thing to happen, which is focusing on the systemic cause and changing your conversation away from what did person do wrong to what allowed that person to end up in this negative situation. What happened around them? What was the systemic cause here? What were the tools they were using? What was the context they had? What was the time of day? How many people had they interacted with? All of that stuff is your goal, because you can change the system such that people don't make mistakes in the future. If all you do is swap people out, if you get rid of another person and bring someone else in, they're still inside of that context that was otherwise negative. So these are all things that you can absorb as CTOs, that you can absorb as technical leaders, that you can absorb as executives. And it's something that you have to be really aggressive about in terms of coming in and continually pushing your culture towards these sort of cultural changes and practice changes when you're dealing with incidents. And I think that they're pretty easy to write down. They can be hard to be diligent about. Whoops. Cool. So breakout. Is that good timing for breakout?
Perfect.
All right, trying to watch the clock here. I'm a fast talker, so I'm getting through these slides as quickly as we can. So the breakout that I had in mind here was, it would be great if we could talk inside of these rooms about like the last major incident in your organization that you were involved in that really brought attention to your org, sort of unexpected attention to your org. And if you were working on that retrospective or postmortem today, what would be the contextual elements that you knew about that incident that the outsiders did not? I think that's a really good way for us to kind of open a conversation about like, what do we know within incidents that we don't necessarily are outsiders know?
We'll give you about 5 or 6 minutes to chat about that. And I'll see you soon. How was that?
Too short.
Nice. That's always a good sign. It's
always kind of flung in and out of the rooms there.
Yeah. We can do the next one a little longer, but it's always a good sign if you wanted more. That's like, hey, this is it. Good. Let's keep going, John. And the next breakout we might do a bit longer. So let's keep going.
Yeah, that was super valuable. Thanks for everyone doing that. I find with a lot of incidents that happen internally, sometimes you can boil these things down to after an incident, there's always things you wish everyone else knew. You always sort of wish if only people knew what happened to me. And I think marrying that a little bit mentally with the idea with sort of avoiding the other side of that coin, which is the embarrassment of what happened and not wanting to talk about it, and accepting that the only way people will know those things you wish they knew is if you don't engage with that embarrassment of not wanting to talk about it in the first place. I think there's some really good blogs out there. I can post them into chat after this that are worth checking out of companies that are good at this. Cloudflare has a whole blog I think called Outage. It's literally called the Outage blog, where they're basically just talking about all the things that go horribly wrong. So it's a great document. Okay, moving forward. All right, let's talk about, now that you've got this concept of everyone in the company needs to be practicing this. Everyone in the company needs to be practicing this core culture of blamelessness when it comes to incidents. You obviously also are going to need a defined incident process, right? And this is a really easy place to mess up. And I have an entire other presentation that's like 2 hours long that digs into a lot of this stuff. So we're only going to scratch the surface of a well-defined incident process. But really what you need to think about when you're establishing your incident process are these two things: repeatable steps, low barriers to entry. Right? You need the process to be something that appears to be incredibly accessible to everyone inside of the organization, or people will simply avoid it. And that requires every one of these steps. It needs to be easy to declare. Factory floors have big red buttons. Actually, I think Stripe calls their incident management system the big red button. And right, the idea here is you don't have to pick up the phone and ask someone if you can push that button. It's right there. If your friend is getting sucked into a machine, you are pushing that button right away. It needs to be easy. Oops. Am I not sharing my presentation? I'm sorry, folks.
No, you're not. No, you're not.
Thank you for calling that out. There we go. How about now? Sorry about that.
Looking good.
like I was saying, repeatable steps, low barrier to entry. So all of these steps need to be repeatable, easy to approach. Declarations, responses, how you respond, the templates you use in your reviews, how you do that distribution. Each of these steps has to be defined in a reasonable way and has to be simple. I'm just going to walk through these. Declaration around big red button. Everyone should be able to do it. Wherever you do your declarations, it should be a platform that everyone has access to. It shouldn't be ACL blocked. Response teams. I've seen a lot of companies where they really limit down the ability for things like on-calls to only exist for technical folks. But the reality is when you have these incident responses, you also need a lot of non-technical folks involved. Do you have on-calls for PR? Do you have on-calls for legal? Do you have on-calls for customer success? Folks who would be involved in the incident process, is their barrier as low as everyone else's barrier to be able to come in, just like your engineers can access these things easily. The resolution process, so your run books, if you have them, your basic guidelines, are those easily accessible? Are they captured, I'm going to talk about in a minute, in a tool, or are they written down somewhere where we have to go open them in a wiki? And then your review and learning process. Most companies only have one postmortem template. Google is sort of at fault for this, for publishing their postmortem template back in 2016, and then everyone pulled it in, and it's this big, complex, difficult postmortem. But the reality is you can have smaller level incidents, right? Sev 3s, Sev 4s, and they can have short postmortem templates, because the more complex that template is, the more unlikely someone is to report an incident in a case where they don't think it justifies that much paperwork. So all of these things need to be defined well inside of the organization and need to be defined in methods where there's at least a perceivable light at the end of the tunnel for everyone who comes into that process, that they can get to the end of it easily. So I'm not a big fan of Wikidocs. For a while, this is how we ran things at some of the other companies I've worked at, right? It's like, oh, we have an incident, open the wiki. And then the wiki's out of date and the information's out of date and the contact folks are out of date, but it's better than nothing. Preferably you're not writing it down this way. Preferably what you're doing is you have a tool internally. Obviously I own a company that builds this tool. So yes, please come use Kintaba, but you don't have to. You can also, define these tools yourself if you have to internally. You can go and write the Slack bot that kicks back into an incident channel basic information for people and sets ground rules and defines who the incident responders are. You can stitch that into something like Google Docs where you have a multitude of different templates that you can use. You can use your existing tools like PagerDuty more effectively by spreading out your on-call rotations to include non-technical roles. But really at the end of the day, if you can centralize this stuff into an individual tool, personally, I think that that's really the best way to do this. The CTO over at Robinhood has a good saying, right? If you want a process, build a tool. It's a very good way to go and do it, because then you can spread this out as UI hints, as actions, as obvious steps that people should take throughout the process while interacting with the tool, as opposed to reading through a document and attempting to discuss that with other folks in the moment. And then finally, we've got encouraging continuous process improvement through learning. It's a very long title. I hate that title. I'm going to change it. But really, this is just about when the incident is over, this is actually your biggest moment, right? This is when you need to take the results of that incident. You need to take that postmortem, and it needs to get distributed as aggressively as possible. I think a lot of companies, they have an incident folder somewhere, and it's packed full of postmortems that have been written that no one's ever read. If you go and look at how Google does this in their SRE book, they have a pretty nice write-up about everything from they have postmortem reading clubs to they make sure to highlight the most interesting postmortem at the company all hands once a week, to they even have a, I think it's something, it's called the Wheel of Misfortune, right? That like makes you have to go and repeat or re-experience an incident that has happened recently, right? Like creating part of the common conversations at the organization to have to do with what happened and how did it happen are really the most important part to creating a learning culture. And this is especially difficult now that we're all remote. In the pre-remote world, a lot of this actually happened in person. It happened over lunches. It would happen in the hallway. It happened from people sitting close to each other and talking about the thing that went wrong and what they learned from it. You got, probably 20, 30% propagation of information just through that. But nowadays, you actually have to spread this information. You actually have to distribute it, to the point where we've started to encourage companies to actually track reads on postmortems, like just like you would a social post, right? How would you SEO a piece of marketing material for your company and make sure the whole world goes and discover it? What is the internal equivalent at your company to trying to SEO important learnings from postmortem documents? Do you have a company newsletter that goes out once a week that maybe people actually read? Include it there. Do you have a weekly check-in with the CEO? Make sure they talk about it. And then reward it, right? Just like rewarding a product push or a successful launch, rewarding the people who are interacting with these incidents, because it is an important part of their job and it's something that benefits the company long-term, and making those rewards public. I've seen companies where they actually pull in the number of incidents you're involved with, and it's basically a penalty for the number of incidents that you quote unquote caused or instigated. There's a great quote from the head of the pilots union from the 90s about why incident culture works so well, coming back to the airline industry again. And it's 100% about the understanding that every postmortem being written is going to be absorbed by not just that organization, but the entire industry. And it's going to be used to make their jobs safer and more successful. And similarly, inside of engineering and technical companies, you can actually replicate a lot of that by, if you want to be really aggressive with it, making your postmortems as public as possible to the point of actually publishing them. I think a lot of you probably hang out on Hacker News, some of these great places. Like a lot of the time, the most talked about posts on forums like Hacker News are the postmortems that companies write. And it's fascinating to watch the tone of those conversations shift from when the incident is happening and everyone from the outside is saying, that's probably a stupid engineering mistake that I understood. There's a great example of this. Robinhood, when they went down, everyone thought it was because of daylight savings time. And the entire conversation thread on Hacker News like devolved into people making fun of coders for not paying attention to daylight savings time. But if you actually talk to the CTO there, they didn't publish this publicly. I wish they had. But he's talked about this publicly, so I feel comfortable talking about it here. The actual problem was they ran out of namespaces for their nodes, and everything fell over because the nodes weren't created anymore. They ran out of characters. They ran out of creations for these things. There's more specifics to it, but it was basically that. And I think if that had come out, the respect within the technical and engineering community for them would have shifted completely the other direction towards, wow, that can happen to me. There are things I need to change as well. So I think propagating your learning culture as publicly as possible is really the best way to go and distribute it internally. Oh, here it is. I actually have the quote. So this is from Charles Billings, who's chief of aviation safety research at NASA, talking about why the system, like what motivates this system in terms of the interest in improving safety, and then the belief that the system will actually be used productively. Everyone's afraid of information being used against them. So we have to publicly, especially as executives, we have to publicly prove that we're going to be using this information for positive outcomes, not for negative outcomes. Great. And with that, I think a really great secondary breakout here would be to talk a little bit about that specifically. What can you do inside of your organization to encourage and reward more participation in your incident management process?
Perfect. See you in 7 or 8 minutes. Okay, so let's wrap this up. This is fascinating. Were those breakouts good?
Yeah, pretty good. Thank you.
Very cool. Very cool. Remember, you can all talk to each other in Slack afterwards and follow up with each other. So make sure you get to know each other. Good. Calvin has a remote API for switching his fireplace on and off. Totally. Ask him about it.
I say I need that as my background. Like a fire actively happening would be a good incident management.
My brain is telling me that warmth is emanating from that Zoom box.
Feel it. You can feel it.
Feel it. Okay, John, this is amazing, man. Let's wrap it up.
Great. Well, so that was the end of the slides. There are a couple of the only other points I was going to make, and I guess I can share this screen too. Hold on one moment. One moment. Let me share this again. So there are lots of resources out there. These are two that I recommend everyone go check out. They're very, very easy to access. The Google SRE book is free. You can access it online. Just search Google for literally Google SRE book. It's a long book, but it has two chapters that are worth looking at that are pretty short. One is incident management, and one is postmortem culture. And they cover a lot of these points, again, more specifically from how Google approaches it. And then I really recommend everyone check out Sidney Decker's Field Guide to Understanding Human Error. It's a really easy to read and consume book. It's filled with really fascinating stories about the airline industry and understanding the human error and human factors side of this industry. And that's really the kind of core cultural part. I think the Google book is a little bit better for like process, if you're trying to get a process up and running and you're looking for a best practice, but the Sidney Decker's book is much better from a cultural standpoint. It'll impact the way that you approach your life, not just the way that you approach incidents inside of your company. It's fantastic work.
Stunning. Well, John, that was amazing. I know people will have to drop off in the next few seconds, so just wave and goodbye. For those who want to hang a little bit, John, do you have a few extra minutes?
I've got 5.
Five?
Yeah, I'm very short. I'm sorry.
No problem. No problem. So if anybody wanted to have a group chat quickly about something, feel free to do it. Otherwise, we can all go. Any final question?
So one question that I have is, postmortem's quality is probably highly dependent to the amount of information that is brought into it. That may mean monitoring, telematics, any type of data. Isn't that something that we should start thinking about as a precursor to doing good incident response in general?
I think it varies pretty wildly by the types of incidents that you're dealing with. There are situations, let me be careful here. So for example, at Facebook, we didn't lean too heavily on like overabundance of metric captures inside of incident reports. The primary goal there was getting the contextual information out of the people who were involved and how they saw like the systemic issues happening. And I think there's sort of a line here where incident management and response sort of overlaps with observability and metrics, which is a really interesting line. And I don't actually think that you have to be perfect at that to go and implement a pretty successful initial incident management process and incident culture. But certainly as you get deeper into it and you start getting to the point where you need to be more effective on, for example, your systemic change follow-up tasks where you have that context, I do think you then need to start layering those in. But I don't think it's a prerequisite. Like, I don't think it has to be in the way. Again, asterisk, different types of companies, different types of incidents, different types of requirements. But on average, I don't think that it's actually a requirement.
Thank you.
Anything else? Good. So we're going to have John's video in our Elevate space. So for the video for that, John, I might reach out to you about potential speaking engagement at our 0111 conference. I'll hopefully reach out to you. Brittany, maybe you can connect us through email. That's cool, John.
Yeah, of course.
And then fantastic, everybody. We will see you next week and see you in Slack. So have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Cool.
Lekker slaap,
Have a
Jaco.
good day. Thank you, Sullivan. Cheers.
Bye.